So yeah, no, evening to everyone who's joining us today. Thank you for being here. I'm going to cancel the sharing. Okay. How do I stop the sharing? Okay. It's not good. But anyway, evening, everyone. Yeah, thank you for being here. So tonight we're going to talk about health tech in Zimbabwe. I'm Simba Mswaka. I'm the programs manager at Tech Hub. Tech Hub is a co-working space and incubator in Harare. So we've brought these very astute gentlemen together tonight, and we're going to discuss health tech. And it's sponsored by Vitruvian MD. That's the video that you saw. Ifthakaar Shaik is the co-founder based out of Joburg. And yeah, they've sponsored this event and they're currently in the Zimbabwean market making inroads. So that's the first guest. The second guest, we have Dr. Marlon-Ralph Nyakabau. He's the Zimbabwean. Okay, he was the former head of Maisha Health, head of Health Cumi International, e-health consultant, and he is now the advisor, I think, at Dr. Cadax, which is a local startup based out of Bulawayo. Thanks, Dr. Nyakabau. Are you there? Let me check if he's there.
Hi, Simba. Hi, everyone.
Nice to have you on board today. And lastly, we have Dr. Chris Fourie. He's a doctor turned data scientist. So he plays with AI and he's very interested in the intersection of theoretical, computational, neuroscience, and machine learning. It's a mouthful, but I'm sure Chris can go deeper for us. So I think we'll leave questions till the end. We'll start with the panelists, and then at the end, save up your questions. You can either put them in the chat, or if you feel brave, you can get on the mic and speak to the panelists. So I think I'll start with Ify, since they are our astute sponsors. Thank you so much. So from the perspective of the layman, right, there isn't much happening, but there are huge issues in the medical field, and I'm sure it's pretty clear for everyone to see. And during COVID, there was a push for digital solutions, namely virtual healthcare and virtual clinics and that sort of thing. So what do you see as the major trends in health tech right now? And can you give us practical examples of applications that can drive real change for individuals?
Yeah, so I think, COVID opened a lot of people's minds and their eyes to a lot of problems in, healthcare system, in terms of delivery. From our side, I mean, you're very, very correct. Virtual healthcare is a big thing. It's a theme. But I think, what COVID did is get people used to this idea of working and living in a bit more of a remote and virtual environment or virtual world. And I think that idea of virtual healthcare, especially like telemedicine, that's a big theme that I think will see evolve, and where we are, it's almost like the start of the e-commerce boom, but in healthcare, where, it took time for people to get used to shopping online. And now it's, you find people are getting a little bit more comfortable talking to doctors online, receiving those type of services. From our side, we're seeing, this openness to the idea of like digital pathology, remote diagnostics, and we fit very squarely into this idea of like telemedicine or telepathology, what we call it, because COVID, showed labs that, well, that's like in sub-Saharan Africa, I think there's one pathologist for every million people, and in a time like COVID, everybody needing to get these test labs were at capacity, and so a lot of other things are falling by the wayside. So I think there's a realization that there's a need for, technology that can ease the burden on all different sides, right? So whether it's diagnostics, if it's, transportation of information, if it's recording information, build something that can actually help you build the right type of data that can facilitate epidemiological studies. So I do think that COVID catalyzed that, and what it really did is it catalyzed or planted this idea in people's mind that it's okay to live in this virtual world, and that we actually have to be open to and embrace it. So I think that's a big thing, and that set this theme that we will see unfold.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Nyakabau, I'll pose the same question to you. What are your thoughts?
All right, thanks very much. Maybe I'll start off with a slight correction. So after leaving the Econet group, I've been working as a digital health consultant, so I kind of went back into consultancy. So I do work with various number of startups and NGOs, anyone who's invested in digital health. And so happens that Dr. Cadex is one of the clients that I have, and I've had the pleasure of working with. So just to air it out there. In terms of COVID, they always say necessity is the mother of invention, and others say never waste a good crisis. So one of the positive things, particularly for our industry, that COVID did is COVID was like a booster shot. The things that weren't taken seriously were then now taken seriously. So, for example, telemedicine. What we have seen with COVID is an increased utilization of telemedicine, even in countries that had the infrastructure, that had the platforms before. I think before people just saw it as a gimmicky thing, but when COVID hit, it then became absolutely essential that people access their doctors via tele platforms or online platforms. So at the peak of the pandemic, I think in countries like the US and the UK, more than 90% of consultations were now actually virtual or through telemedicine, initiating what was called a digital first approach. And I've also interacted with colleagues in the Middle East, like in Saudi Arabia, they also testified the same, to say it went that high. That's in contrast to a 5% utilization that was before COVID. So when the pandemic kind of settled, the utilization went down to about 25%, which is 5 times what it was before. So certainly one of the things that emerged from COVID has been the increased utilization of telemedicine. Things got also a bit more exciting, I think, because everyone wanted to help in. So there are some solutions that came in with the tracking of vaccines and the use of biometrics, even technologies where people wanted to track people that are in quarantine to make sure that they are sticking within their allocated GPS coordinates and that they're not going around. So there was an infusion of ideas and an infusion of investments. Even electronic health records, again, also enjoyed a boost as a result of COVID. So some of them, when things then settle down, will not survive the calm. So some of them maybe will get relegated back to the backbenches. But what we certainly are seeing is increased utilization, increased acceptance of telemedicine, and then a wave in electronic health records is some of the foundational pieces of digital health, as much as others like AI continue to grow.
Thanks for that. Dr. Fourie, do you want to add something about that? I know you have to add something about AI.
Sure. So, right. So maybe the answers I'm going to give you guys is a bit of a non-answer, and maybe also just to add a little bit more perspective to know where I'm coming from. So, I qualified as a medical doctor I got my degree in 2015, and I've just finished a master's now in computer science, in machine learning. I'm currently working for a company based out of Atlanta in the States, in the USA, and we do continuous monitoring and remote monitoring focusing a lot on like the kind of diagnoses that you can do through wearables. So what I find, and because again, I haven't done, I think like digital health consulting, like Dr. Sorry if I get your name wrong, but Nyakabau, is that correct? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah.
Marlon will do, Chris.
Marlon, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marlon. I appreciate that. So yeah, so I don't have the same like touch points to be able to give you guys feedback on what I see, at least in the African context, what's happening there. What I can say though is there's something that's really lacking from like the African context when it comes to having hard data on the uptake of these kind of technologies. So I think there are two main ways that I see information about this being disseminated. And I'm going to divide those into like the academic space and like industry spaces. So generally in the academic space, we see this coming through in like survey papers where people will look at a field like digital healthcare and machine learning, and then they'll write about that, whether it's like in cancer or like computer vision for medical imaging, and they'll try collate a whole bunch of different papers together and provide some sort of synopsis of what's going on there. Now, while we see that for maybe certain problems related to the African context, we don't really see that for research in like Africa. I mean, on a global scale, I've definitely seen more papers in digital health coming out, so that's promising. And then on the industry side, we also have surveys, similar name, different though. So the way that they conduct their surveys are a little bit more how consulting companies would do this, and they find people in the industry and they ask them questions about, what are you guys using, what's important to you, and we don't really have that information in Africa, and I think that's really problematic. So, like an example of a good one, and I'll share a link to this in the chat. Like for instance, the European Union has a very good data on where digital health is going. And I look at this and I say, why don't we have this? So one of the other things that I do is I help co-found a community called Sisonke Biotic. We're kind of like branched off of a group called Mswaka. And if anyone here has heard of like the deep learning Indaba, we fall in like that sort of space. So it's all about participatory research and just trying to lower the barriers to getting involved in machine learning and healthcare. So one of the projects that we're running there is specifically like large scale collaborative paper to write a survey on specifically healthcare and machine learning from Africa to spotlight what Africans are researching in that space, because I think that is like the first step to solving our problems, right? So it's a bit of a long answer.
Okay, well, that's interesting, Chris. Let me just move to Dr. Nyakabau here, and so yeah, you spoke about research papers and so forth. So we know that it takes a bit of time to get things going in the medical field because of the type of product we're selling. I mean, it's health, so it's pretty sensitive. So it's highly regulated for good measure. So what is your experience dealing with regulators, and how could they make the environment more conducive for health tech startups? That's Dr. Nyakabau. We've got a few startups in the audience. They want to know this. Is he there?
Well, I would say in terms of digital health, we don't have enough. Yes, health as an overall field is regulated, and rightly so, because we're dealing with human lives and we want to ensure that whatever technology we do leads to no harm. But what we actually have is not enough a regulation. And that's something that we can celebrate and also can be a hindrance. Speaking as maybe happy when you get into an environment where there are no laws, because then it means you can then kind of proceed to go and pilot and test your things without having to cross too many, having to tick too many boxes and and cross many red tapes. But what we also know is that regulation, particularly if it's done in a clever way, can actually accelerate the adoption of innovation. And I always talk about the good example that the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was how much it was a booster to digital health in the States, in that it created incentives for doctors to adopt electronic health record systems in their practices. And as soon as it was passed, there was quite a huge jump in the adoption of electronic health records. So regulation or policies can actually accelerate or stimulate the adoption of innovation. So in Zim, we don't have much, and I know, I think I sit in one of the committees of the Medical Council. I'm aware that there's work that is being done towards, informing the profession on guidelines on telemedicine. So that's work in progress. And we have had quite bad instances before. For example, there was a clash when Econet started this dialogue initiative back in 2015. They kind of clashed with the regulator, the Medical Council. And then another glaring example is with Dr. Okay, she's now Dr. Ludzai Murray, when she wanted to start a service for educating people on the availability of pharmaceuticals, that she had to get to the Supreme Court, taking the Pharmacist Council to the Supreme Court. And then the good thing is she won. And after winning, now she has a service or a business running, which is known as the Medical Information Service, or MIS. So we've had those instances, but like I was saying, we don't have enough. We need regulation that governs how data is managed. Too many solutions come in and take data and export it, and it's hosted on foreign servers, and we have no access to it. We also need policies or regulation that kind of enforce interoperability to ensure that we have a certain quality of application that are introduced on the market. So there is a bit more work that is done, and we just hope that it is done in a clever way where it actually comes in to guide and stimulate the adoption of innovation, and not then to stifle it.
Okay, thanks for that. I think I'll then pass the question on to you, Ify, since you are a founder of a startup. You face regulation obviously in the South African market, and you're looking to expand. I mean, you are in Zimbabwe, but not fully. So what's your experience with regulation? And yeah.
So look, I mean, I think, regulation, obviously, it's important, it's needed, and that really protects the public, from unscrupulous actors. But it can actually be quite the barrier to innovation and deployment. And I'll tell you from where. I mean, I think Marlon's points around, Obamacare and driving adoption in certain things, or at least encourage, is good, and it can drive it to an extent. But when you're actually dealing with regulators, and you think about like startups, startups are typically, some guys with some ideas, they come up with some idea, with something clever that can solve a problem. But then you run into this issue very quickly. Like, how do you actually deploy this? How do you get your first paying customer? And actually you can't until you pass through some type of regulatory hurdle. And that's in like most jurisdictions in the world. I think there's about 48 countries that we've identified where they don't have medical device regulation. I mean, South Africa, only about 3 or 4 years ago, actually started putting together a proper framework, for this. So you left in this situation where you're saying, okay, but you want to change the world, you want to make this, open and make quality healthcare accessible to as many people as possible. But like, how do you deal with it when the people who are innovating and who are close to the ground and understanding what the problems are can't actually afford to go through regulatory, processes, and and if you kind of, structure your clinical trials and you've done all of that, then it's actually dealing with the regulators, the time to get, information back. I mean, I know within South Africa, we managed to get a medical device license in like 11 months, and that was apparently quick. Now, imagine if you're a startup, you're covering your costs, you can't sell anything to anyone until, you've got your license, you're burning through your runway. Where does this leave you? Right. And so it seems like a lot of regulation it's very skewed and biased towards bigger players who have bigger balance sheets. And I think because of that, you're probably not getting the best outputs for the markets that you can possibly get. That being said, I mean, there are these countries where there's lower regulation that you can actually reach out to and actually test your products. But for us, I mean, our issue is when we scale outside of South Africa into other regions, as we're looking at now with like our fertility products, dealing with like UK regulators and Europe and America, the costs increase exponentially, right? And so you actually have to start raising money just to deal with that. So yeah, I do think that regulation can create quite a barrier from that point of view. But now on the flip side, like, how do you actually solve this? So we know what the problem is. I think there's, from like a government point of view or regulator point of view, I think they can carve out, certain exceptions for certain startups and create a bit of a sandbox where you can do very limited testing, that allows the regulator and yourself to get comfortable about what you're doing. You see that in like even in FDA, rather than doing like a full FDA application for something like the AI tech, there's things called like the 510K, which is a little bit cheaper, but I mean, for most startups from South Africa, a $75,000 process is expensive. That's like a whole funding raise for smaller companies, but it's significantly cheaper and faster to get through the process than some of the other full regulation processes. So yeah, I think sandboxing, carving out like limited test environments where startups with new ideas can be launched to like a limited trial population that the regulator oversees. I think that could actually go a long way to at least fast tracking and facilitating that process.
Okay. Dr. Nyakabau, I can see you want to respond. Or should I pass it to Dr. Fourie?
No, I can quickly come in. I think the example of the FDA is good. That even another example on what they choose to regulate. So I think there are different tiers of what they choose to regulate. So there are certain apps that if it's just providing health education, they won't really rigorously look at it. But then if it's an app that is connected to a physiological parameter or it's going to influence the amount of medication that someone gets, then that is classified differently and undergoes a stricter regulation. So I think that approach is good to kind of have a tiered system so that we don't treat everyone the same. I just wanted to say that in our environment, when I was saying that we don't have enough, is that sometimes you get one rotten apple that then spoils everything. Apps that quickly go to market, and because there isn't enough regulatory environment in there, they mess it up, so that when you then follow up with your own idea, you then have to kind of apologize or try to fix the mess that those that would have gone before you. So we need that balance that's there, so that we ensure that then some people don't come in with their half-baked solutions that are not well thought out, and they proceed to then spoil it for everyone.
Thanks.
So, man, I just want to add something to that. So I think I fully agree with you, but I mean, from our side, especially being on the startup side and going through these hurdles, I fully agree that I think you need the regulation to prevent these unscrupulous actors and guys with half-baked ideas 100%. But I do think that expecting like startups to go through a full regulatory process to have you incur a lot of costs as a full clinical trials. Regulator, and possibly this is where government can also be in place, can set up small sandboxes, like limited trial environments where, you could guide, smaller, startups. So or even like carve it out a license that you're only allowed to operate within a very fixed, narrow band, and make it a lot more affordable one, and also just easier to get to that point. And then you can iterate and test much quicker, come back. And if you are, causing damage in the market, or you have done something wrong, the regulator can step in a lot faster, and you can actually pick up on those issues a lot quicker than, trying to hit a market and try and sell in many places. So I do think that balance needs to be struck. Otherwise, it'll limit a lot of innovation, I think.
Let me pass this to Chris. So Chris, you're a computer data scientist and a doctor. What's your take on all of the regulation?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say I'll try coming from like an AI perspective, because I do work both as a software engineer and as a machine learning scientist. So, I mean, there's a lot that has been said, and it's a lot to unpack, and also like regulations, a very big topic, and it's especially important in healthcare. And you're right, I completely agree with you that you want to try and strike a balance that makes sense without. And I'm going to try perhaps here stick to topics on perhaps data privacy, because healthcare data needs to be private, first and foremost, because it can be abused in so many different ways. So one of the things that I see there that is really promising are things like privacy preserving AI. So these are techniques that have been developed over the last 10 years or so. There's a really great group they're called Open Mind. I'll send a link in the group in the chat as well. They've got a Python library called PySift that's supposed to be a quick to gets up and running. And their slogan is basically do machine learning on data that you don't own. So the idea there is that they use multiple different techniques where it's I'm just going to throw words out there, and I apologize for this. So they use things like homomorphic encryption, which is basically just magic with maths to essentially do computation on encrypted data and then provide encrypted results. So as a service provider, you can have someone give you data that's encrypted. You can have your machine some of you might know, and things like differential privacy. The costs to be adhering to regulation. Some of the problems that still, at least that I've encountered, exist there are regulators aren't aware of these things and are unaware of their efficacy. So I don't deal necessarily a lot in my day-to-day with medical device regulators. The company I work for does. They deal mostly with the FDA because they have a global market. The one thing I'll say on that point, at least for startups, I think it's very good to understand the difference between FDA clearance and FDA approval. And as far as I know, AI has been classified under medical devices as I think is a catch-all for the kind of regulation that they're trying to get it to adhere to. But in my own experience, I deal more with getting ethics approval for research. So one of the problems there is, unlike the FDA, it's not one monolithic structure that has standards. It's generally hospitals or academic institutions that each have their own ethics boards with their own sort of standards and precedents and stuff. And what I think we really see there, because a lot of AI, I mean, I think everyone knows that it's fueled off of data. And if we want to get data that is good for the African context, we need African health data sets. So to try and make those accessible, you need to get these institutions to pass ethics clearance to get this data available. And I think what we need there is some sort of standard procedures that are, I mean, they do have standard procedures, but some, I'm going to say, more standard than they are at the moment. And then also precedent on these newer technologies that allow for us to make data more accessible. Yes, that's my 2 cents on that. Also, sorry, one more thing. I just want to comment
Yeah,
on something
go
that Marlon said, like around shipping our data overseas. And I think that's a really important topic. I mean, I think that falls under the heading of data sovereignty. And I mean, I see this a lot in like the data science space. We're having like, we're seeing like a real like reinforcement of these historical like, geopolitical power asymmetries. And I really think it comes down to African governments to stop this kind of data extraction. So yeah, I mean, I guess as people in that space, it's up to us to put pressures on our governments. And then like the flip side of that coin that people will argue, and I can speak about this from like the software side, is everything now is cloud compute. And what does data sovereignty mean when all of your data is distributed in multiple data warehouses like across the planet? And what does that mean for like implementation? Like how much harder and how much more expensive does that make this kind of stuff for startups who are already struggling to finance themselves for regulation, right? So it's also, it's a bit of a balancing act.
Okay, thanks for that. I think we should say that if he comes from an actuarial background, so he's the non-doctor. So if he sounds a bit left, it's because he's a bit different. But anyway, so I'll take this, Dr. Nyakabau. How do you see tech really making a difference? And what has your experience been dealing with adoption of tech solutions with corporates and users/customers? Because you find that people try and gravitate towards the norm. They're used to things that they've always been doing. For example, if I work in a lab, I may not be comfortable using Chris's AI because I went to college and they taught me to use some manual process. So what do you have to say about that interaction with corporates and users?
All right, thanks. Definitely the use of technology or the leveraging of technology can make a difference. And I think that's in my earlier days of e-health evangelism, I guess that's what I used to preach about, to try and get people to take this seriously. And I think over the maybe 8 or so years, I think that's somewhat fairly established with many examples of successful implementation of digital health, that are there, and the documentation is increasing. Around towards the end of last year, working with an organization called I think it's Tech Change. We managed to come up with a document that was showcasing how digital health was being used to enable the achievement of universal health coverage. So that's increasing access to care, making it more affordable and of a good quality. So across Africa, there are various examples of applications of that. So the case for technology coming in to make a difference is largely, I think it's now being appreciated. It's much better than what we had to go through before. But then the adoption of tech, it's up to several factors. That's what I've learned. That sometimes it's if an app or a technology is not adopted or does not gain a large number of users, it's not because there is something intrinsically wrong with the application, whether it's to say it's the user experience or just the idea. There are several things in the environment that need to be considered. So in digital health, we talk about a framework that looks at the enabling environment for successful implementation of digital health, that looks at 7 things. So in many factors, it could be one of those. I recently with the NGO called Solidamed that have been in Zimbabwe for years and have been doing some fantastic work on e-health in rural areas. So one of the challenges that they noted, it wasn't to do with something wrong with the tech. It's the enabling environment, the factor of the workforce or the human resources, that generally with how doctors working when
hello, how are you?
Can you please mute? I think we're getting, thank you very much. Yes, one of the factors that you look at is workforce. So in Zim, we have, sorry to say, but we have demotivated health staff, particularly within the government sector. So, we introduce a solution, the way they approach it, they might see it as extra work, or they might want some cash incentive for them to use it, because they're generally demotivated. We have a crisis where a lot of doctors and nurses are leaving the country. So one of the challenges is noted up that you can get to an institution, train nurses to say, use this app or this system, and then everyone is trained. You come back a couple of months later, all the nurses that you have trained have left, have gone to the UK, have gone to seek greener pastures, and it seems like you then have to, repeat the process. So we need to use that framework of looking at the environment, including the legal framework, including the policy, including the national strategy. So sometimes it's not just about an app, something wrong with an app, but it could be if the economy is not favorable, then it's the economy. It's not the technology.
Yeah, let me.
No, I just want to.
Okay. Yeah, no. If you can,
I think
can add to that.
Marlon made a great point there. No, Marlon makes a great point over there. Africa suffers from this brain drain, right? And as you mentioned, in Zimbabwe, with nurses leaving, doctors leaving, etc. But that exacerbates this problem that I was mentioning earlier on, where there's, at least we do a lot of research in the pathology space. We know what those statistics look like, but that translates across the healthcare. And so even though maybe adoption is not good, and this is just a general statement to everyone here, it highlights the fact that there is a need for technology, right, to come in and bridge the gap. So, while it's also quite negative, if you put another hat on, it's a positive opportunity, right? Because especially if you take the work that Chris would do in AI, and you marry it over here, that has a lot of power to bridge that skills gap that's short in the market. So it was just a general statement.
Yeah, but you can continue to talk about what's your experience with the users.
Yeah, so perfect. Yeah. So look, from our side, again, I tell you, we were kind of fortunate in the sense that, we started our business around about the middle of COVID. And, but prior to starting it, we had been talking to a lot of the pathology labs, and we identified that there was this need. And this need was exactly what we've just been talking about, the shortage of skills. And excuse me, Patrick, do you mind maybe just muting?
Let me mute him, it's fine. I'll mute him.
Yeah. So this shortage of skills is actually what we identify as a major problem across the emerging markets in sub-Saharan Africa and emerging markets in general. And so because we're also approaching guys at such a critical time. Yes, it was difficult to get the meetings, etc. But we started these conversations earlier. In their mind, this penny dropped, and they said, okay, we shorten staff. There's this technology that can allow us to handle a bit more cases, at least in certain verticals. This is something that we should be investing our time and our energy in understanding and adopting. So for us, we have been blessed and fortunate that the corporates that we've been dealing with, like the labs, etc., have been very, very open to working with us. In fact, one of them, one of the largest groups in South Africa, is a strategic investor in us. So that's kind of the extent. Of course, you're always going to run into problems. Again, medicine, it's a core need. Typically you need to be conservative, and you're going to run into people who are overly conservative, possibly been in the industry for a long time, gotten used to doing things in a certain way, and you might run into barriers amongst these people, or at these people. But there's enough opportunity. There's a lot of younger doctors. There's a lot of people who want to embrace change, and if you look hard enough, you'll find them, and those will be your first. At least for us, those are our first champions, I'd say, in trying to adopt and help us develop our tech. So that's the one thing. The other thing I can say, which is maybe a piece of advice and something that we've learned, in tackling these types of industries where there are people resistant to change, and rightly so, right? Taking something new in medicine, you have to be skeptical about it because you're dealing with people's lives, dealing with their health. But very importantly is to involve people in that process of change and development. And that's what we did, when we were developing our AI, we still are, developing our tech. From the start to the end, we always had the doctors involved, right? All the pathology labs. So they were with us constantly iterating, they'd be our first testers, we're getting the feedback, we're taking that back in. When we developed our imaging tools, it worked and we could give outputs with AI. But what we realized is the experience for a doctor, the amount, how they view fidelity, it might just be different to how an engineer is going to see fidelity. And if something's slightly off from your eye, can you really trust that? Where else is this thing off from your eye? And so that level of perfection, that understanding of how a person thinks, how a doctor thinks and how they solve a problem from start to end is very important. And we were very, very conscious of that from the start and incorporated that thinking into what we do. So, even when we do, we make AI, we don't call it like artificial intelligence, we call it humanistic AI, because we believe like in this interaction between a human being and this machine to give you just better outcomes. And so that's our experience. I mean, it's been favorable, but we'll see how it is when we start to scale across beyond our borders. And I mean borders, sub-Saharan Africa, beyond that.
All right. Yeah. So I think I've heard AI said a couple of times. So this is perfect for Chris. This is your baby. So AI.
So I gotta echo. Yeah.
Oh.
So good.
Okay. Can you hear me clearly now? Yeah. So AI and machine learning, these are super powerful tools, especially in healthcare. I mean, you can duplicate processes, etc. So which parts of the healthcare system would you like to see more use of AI and like why?
Cool. So I'm gonna quickly put a pin in that question, and I'm gonna circle back around to it, just because I want to echo both what Ifthakaar and Marlon have said. I mean, and that is like software is hard, right? And software when you're using machine learning is even harder. And trying to get to build that trust with your like end user and your doctors or your healthcare practitioners is a very hard job. Also, if you just want to comment on the one thing, we call it like humanistic AI. I also laugh sometimes because I think people are worried about like AI coming to replace them. And even though that's not the case because we're so far away from that, we still tend to use these words to describe our work. And I think one I hear a lot more in the space is also like computer-aided diagnosis, because radiologists and pathologists are like, hey, the computers are coming for our jobs. But again, they are just tools to make your lives easier, like any other kind of tool. So yeah, again, software is really hard. Software when you're doing machine learning is even harder. And where I see a lot of these things failing, just like both Ify and Marlon have said, is if you don't incorporate like good user experience in the loop of development, or like healthcare practitioner in the loop of developments, then you can have this amazingly like engineered like data pipeline or something like that, and you try and deploy it, and like people just don't want to use it because it's uncomfortable, it's not ergonomic, like there's some misalignment in like the use case or something. So that's just like a really important thing that I feel the need to reiterate, because I see that happening a lot. And again, you say, where do I want to see like machine learning used more in the healthcare sector? And I hear a lot of like, hey, 4IR this and 4IR that. And the problem is, before we can do like the fourth industrial revolution, you got to do 3IR or 2IR. We need some kind of like basis to build off of. And if I just look at like even the South African healthcare sector, like the government sector, like a lot of the stuff is still like pen and paper. Like we need digital health records to be able to do machine learning. So, one thing that I feel like really passionate about is what I call open digital infrastructure. And I'll send the link of where like that is really been successful. And that is in the cloud computing space. So pretty much like the stuff that like Amazon and Google and Microsoft run on, a lot of that infrastructure, that digital infrastructure, like the highways, the bridges of the internet, have been developed in an open source manner so that the code is freely available and can be used as like a public utility. And I find it so strange that we don't see the same thing happening for like electronic health records. Like a government will go and spend millions on like repairing potholes, maybe if you're lucky, or like building a bridge or something, but and that's then a public utility for everyone to use, but they won't put money into developing an open source electronic healthcare record system. And I'm like, why is this? And interestingly enough, and again, something else I'll send in the chat, because I'm all about links, is I think since about 2014, the South African government has like a mandate that says if we can't show that proprietary software is better than the open source like alternative, we need to use the open source alternative, and we don't see that happening. Often we see, and I think that maybe if you'll be able to like talk to this, because I imagine you'd have to like integrate with some of the pathology systems, but I imagine there are, they get locked into these like very like expensive and long contracts with like service providers, when what we really should be doing is developing our own infrastructure. And then only once we have that infrastructure can we talk about where do we use machine learning, right? But yeah. So
listen, I mean, I want to add to that. I think that's a very, very good point, right? I mean, you try. I mean, exactly that. You want to try and build artificial intelligence, but you actually have nothing, right? There's no digital infrastructure. I mean, we started off. We thought we were clever. We were going to build some smart software. We're going to give it to the labs, and then you're going to, process some images, and you're going to get data. But when you actually get down to it, if you're not a large lab in the sense of, I don't know, Stanton or something, you don't actually have the resources to have the high-end digital equipment. And so everything is actually still, pen and paper, as Chris says, or analog, when you're operating in like normal microscopes. And so you need to try and find a way of bridging that gap. I mean, we had to do it because we're dealing with samples, and developing and inventing, our specialized camera. But it's equally, I mean, there needs to be some infrastructure that actually takes normal health records and put it in there, because the problem that we're going to face is that this long-term research and epidemiological thinking is not going to be there, and you actually need to start pooling this data from now going forward so that you can start this research process. And without that, what you're going to find is like lots of these small companies, and as Chris mentioned earlier on, you have this data extraction from like foreign entities, just sucking out data in Africa, and Africa doesn't really benefit from that. And so lots of these little companies build their own little silo data that don't really speak to everything else. And actually, the people that get screwed here are Africans, right? Because your data leaves or you're not building the right foundations that create or allow for the creation of tools that can actually benefit you. So it just makes that problem a lot more difficult. So I think, Chris, that's a great point.
Thanks, Ify, for that.
I appreciate that.
I think I'll probably be our last question. So let me start with Marlon. So how can we as practitioners in health tech encourage governments to spend more in the sector, especially Zimbabwe, South Africa? We know we've got major issues with health. Like, how do we encourage them to jump on board?
All right. You I think in a way, sometimes you need to be careful in how much you want the government to be involved. Sometimes you don't want them anywhere near, because the moment they get involved, they might actually slow things down. But certainly, we can't do without them, and they do have a pivotal role to play. Just as Chris was mentioning, to say why is it there isn't enough resources devoted to such things as ensuring that the electronic health records in our systems. I think what African governments just need to do in general is to invest more in health. I think that one thing that I've understood, the countries related health to being something for the donors. So it's Global Fund, UNICEF, Bill and Melinda Gates. They kind of then say, you guys come in and take care of the of our health issues, including sometimes to the purchase of condoms. So the moment I think we start driving towards 15%, that Abuja declaration that governments allocate 15% of their budgets towards health, then I think we can then get more investment towards digital health, because this is then their money. And if it's their money, they then want to ensure it's being used effectively. So we won't spend needlessly large amounts of money in printing huge paper-based systems when they could just easily be replaced by a well thought out, well planned out mobile app or web app or something like that. So that's what we need. But overall, I think for the industry, with having so many entrepreneurs and startups on the call, I guess what we really would like the governments to do is to do what I think good governments do, which is stay in the background, but they set up the environment, they set up the playing field, and they set the rules. So an analogy that I always use is to say they are the FIFA. So FIFA declares to say the rules for the game are that a handball is not allowed, and then there's offside or whatever. They set the rules, and then players then come in and play according to those rules without having to have FIFA having its own team that's taking on the field. So we need government to set the environment. So one of the things that they could do is to set interoperability to say, okay, this is the minimum standard or quality of a solution that would approve. And then when they set that kind of environment, sometimes it's not up to them to always come up with their own solutions as governments or its ministries. Once you've set that environment that's nicely defined, then private players can then find room to. So with Zimbabwe, we just they just published the next the digital health strategy for the next 5 years. And one of the things that I think it does really well is to set the kind of like the governance framework for digital health, because before, if you want to that body for all things that are digital health. So those are guys that know about digital health. To say, okay, this is how we can take your solution. So that will go a long way. They're still kind of understaffed, but it's a step in the right direction in terms of establishing an enabling environment for players to flourish.
Okay, thanks for that. Chris, do you want to add something about what governments can do?
So, I mean, I feel like in my last answer, I kind of touched on that. I mean, maybe, what can we do to help governments, or like, what do I think will encourage governments to spend on this? And I really do think we just need to have like a really good track record of successful projects, because I think what happens, and what I've seen happening, and sorry, I don't actually have the link for the next thing I'm going to say, so I can't substantiate it, but I will. I do believe in this stat. I think recently, one of the consulting houses did a review on like how many machine learning projects were successful, and the stat is really low. It's something like 13 or like 15%, and that's because it's a very very hard thing to get right, and you need it's and the problem is, if you're now going to go with that stats to the any government and you say, look, please invest in this idea, but across the board it looks like only 15% of the time this is going to work, and that's only if you're like a Google or a Microsoft or something like that. I think what we really need to do is we need to have like more realistic strategies for our digital health, and maybe like have projects that are I'm not going to say like less ambitious, that's not the right word to say, but I think we need as a group to perhaps collaborate more and have the just more conversations around how to do this properly. So like events like we're doing right now, I think are like the right thing to do, because through these events we can network, we can talk, we can say, cool, what works. You're a doctor, I'm a software engineer. Let's get together and like make something that works. And I think the more like the better we can like get with our track record as a community, that will, I think, eventually be the thing that helps us get funding for these kind of projects and buy-in from governments and funders in general.
Thanks for that, Chris. Ify, do you want to add something to that, and then we will go to questions?
Look, I mean, my view, similar to what Marlon says, I think governments need to just kind of set this playing field, but really you want them to stay in the background. The one thing I do think, that governments can do a little bit better is possibly, you see with these corporates, when they do these hackathons, they have certain lots of problems that need to be solved, and they open it up to smart guys or people who are willing to come up with certain solutions, and you have this environment, an off-taker who's actually willing to try out what these solutions are. I think, like in government, it's probably beyond just healthcare. I think if they open it up in that way, for students even, or other operators actually try and solve these problems, I think you'll see a lot more innovation and possibly, a lot more of these issues that you find in government or in our processes of healthcare being solved. But I mean, I think the other guys covered it largely, what government should be doing or shouldn't.
Thanks for that, guys. I think now we'll go to questions. Rutendo had a question and they left, so let's try and address that. I don't know who, anyone can take this. So it says, are there any regulations on the creation of synthetic data based on the patient data that we already use as a testing sandbox? Based on the data that we already have, sorry. Who would like to?
I can add my 2 cents from our experience, and Chris, I mean, you can comment. I'm sure you have some experience in this. It depends on what you mean by synthetic data. Maybe you can clarify that. But I mean, if you take like any sample of data, you typically want to augment it to some extent and replicate it, right? So I don't know, if you take like in fertility, analyzing sperm cells, you might only have a limited data set, but you can multiply that versus various types of augmentations, etc., to build up your data set. But if you were to use, like, let's say, generative nets to create data from scratch, the issue that you find in the medical space, which is different to like voice, etc., is that if you look at a slide, right, you look at a sample of tissue, there can be a very, very subtle difference, a shade of color, a speck of something that can mean the difference between identifying cancer and not, right? Now, if you had to use synthetic data, you might be missing these features, because effectively what's happening is a computer is almost imagining new versions of something that it's seen before. And I think that can create a little bit of an issue when it comes to actually training nets, because that these algorithms are only as good as the information that you feed it.
Sure, and if I'm going to segue from that, because you covered some good points there. Again, it's always very good to clarify what you mean by synthetic data. So I'm going to use an example like outside of the healthcare space to like exemplify why sometimes, like depending on how you're creating synthetic data, it can be dangerous. So let's take something that I think people might be familiar with, like OpenAI's GPT-3. It's a large language model. It can like write essays. It can do like a bunch of really impressive stuff. There's a case where there are people using it to like generate their own like about me web pages. And someone posted on Twitter, a particular about me page, like, hey, look what GPT-3 did. Well, sorry, let me rephrase that. The like standard one of the about me pages that kept on coming up, and like again, I'm paraphrasing the story, was of an individual that actually exists. And this guy was like, hey man, this is me. And essentially what had happened is the way that this large language model had generated the synthetic data, it had essentially like memorized something on the internet, right? And what that means is it makes these neural nets vulnerable to adversarial attacks. So you can get what they call like reconstruction of data in these cases. And I talked a little bit earlier about like federated learning. And like, while I still think federated learning is a great idea, it again isn't a silver bullet. So one of the things so what federated learning is you can take a neural net or a machine learning model, and I can give it to Iffy, let's say, and he can show it the model his data, and the model will learn. And then I can give it to someone else, and that model will learn some more. And then they can give the model back to me, and then I can use that to make like a diagnosis. Without myself or my organization seeing any of that data, it's only the model itself. It's contained in the connections in those neurons. And now, while that's great because it means I can build a model from data sets from like multiple different institutions, where none of those institutions have to essentially share data with one another. If you don't do it in a safe way, there are cases where you can do these like reconstructions of data. So this is something that like one should be aware of when thinking about like synthetic data, or things like federated learning or something like that. Yes.
Okay. Makes sense. Let me stay with you. There's a question here. It says, interesting point that you make about electronic health records. Why do you think that's an area that's not progressing? What are the main challenges? That's AM.
So I think it's something that Marlon said earlier when he talked about like interoperability. And one of the big things in software is making systems like interoperable, like one, and like, let's say, extensible. So if I have software that I want to keep on developing and like expand, it's very hard to do that. First of all, if it's proprietary, because you can't get access to that, and you can't. It doesn't have the same potential for expansion, like unless it's going to be something that some big organization decides to try and like monetize on. And again, then you're creating like these really weird power asymmetries, which is also a problem. So I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier, what I really think needs to happen there is making infrastructure, particularly infrastructure open source, means is you get two things for free, essentially. You get interoperability because everything is open, or at least the potential for interoperability, and you get standardization through adoption. So instead of having top-down standardization where you have a council of people saying, I think this is the best thing for that, or we should build the system in this way, what you have is a marketplace of competing ideas to become the standard for infrastructure, and then those come about through whoever wins the race there. Which again, you have your pros and your cons, because if you've ever looked at your keyboard, it's a QWERTY keyboard, it's suboptimal. That's an argument against standardization through adoption. But yeah, everything at the end of the day is what we call multi-objective optimization, which means you got multiple things that you're trying to select for or make optimal. So you just have to take whatever trade-off works best for your context. However, in this particular case, I do think that, at least from what we've seen in the cloud software space, we need open source for infrastructure when it comes to healthcare. And I'll be a strong proponent for that, because I do believe in it. Yeah.
All right, thanks for that, Chris. This question is for Iffy. If there's anyone else who has a question, write in the chat or raise your hand, because we're going to wrap up soon. So yeah, but this is for Iffy. So you mentioned working on fertility. What are you guys doing in that space?
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So we're doing quite a bit in fertility. I think maybe I'll just talk about the stuff that we're most excited about right now. So on the male side of fertility, I think that's it's a part of fertility that I think has been less focused on for a long time. I think you'll find in couples where they struggle to have children, a lot of the pressure has always fallen on the female side, and less so on the male side. Although there is sperm analysis and sperm testing. Now, we've been focusing on this to try and better or enhance the way that sperm is actually analyzed. And one of the things that we're pioneering right now is a chemical-free, non-destructive way of being able to determine the level of DNA fragmentation in sperm. Now, when sperm is very fragmented, you might be able to fertilize an oocyte, create an embryo, but that might still lead to a miscarriage, right? So what actually happens in the labs is they do certain types of tests that require chemicals that will give you a DNA fragmentation index. And if it's low, let's just say less than 10%, it means you're actually producing fairly healthy sperm. Now, the issue comes in when you actually go through the IVF process. So ICSI, something called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, when you actually need to take sperm and inject it into an oocyte to create an embryo. Now, if I told you that 90% of your sperm is good, 10% of them are kind of fragmented, that's a statistic. You're a healthy guy. Now I'm going to use your sperm in this ICSI process. So I gave you 10 sperm on a slide. You're going to have to choose one to put it into this oocyte. Now, yes, you've got a 90% chance of choosing, good sperm, but you could be choosing that one that's actually not good, right? Or that's highly fragmented. Now, the issue comes in that the IVF process, to be able to, that stimulation process on a female is very expensive, but it's not just expensive financially, also on the human body, from all the hormonal treatment. And actually just having a miscarriage in itself can be quite, emotionally taxing. So what we try to do is we want to shave off as much error as possible from all of these different elements of the process. And so with our tech, what you're going to be able to do now is find the level of fragmentation of sperm without damaging it, and then actually use that sperm in the ICSI process to fertilize the egg. And so now we move from this situation where doctors are just choosing at random to actually guiding you to kind of select the best sperm that would lead to better IVF outcomes. So I think that's what we're really excited about. There's some other very interesting things that are a little bit earlier on where we're building data sets and we're working very closely with the doctors. That might be even more exciting, but this is pretty much a world first that we're going to be putting out to the market. So very, very excited about that.
All right, thanks for that, Ify. Yeah, I just wanted to say it is pretty cool watching sperm under the microscope. For anyone who isn't a doctor, I think it's more exciting than blood. You need to see it.
Whose sperm were you looking under the microscope, though, Simba? Where were you doing this?
That's another question. I think there's no more questions, so I think everyone can give some parting shots. We can start with Dr. Nyakabau. Any parting shots before we close?
Maybe there was a question on EHRs and their adoption. I think one of the things it's certainly changing. Take Zimbabwe for example, maybe as well as part of this is good to say as a parting shot that the future seems much brighter. Zimbabwe is in the process of rolling out a national electronic health record system. And the plan is that by the end of, by December 2023, they would have equipped all the health facilities, including rural health centers, all the health facilities under the Ministry of Health, that all of them will be using an electronic health record system. So that's, an EHR is a foundational piece to everything, including big data, AI. So that's a good thing to have. What we then ask ourselves is, why is this happening only in 2022? So it's because they began developing their own proprietary EHR system back in 2015. They decided to build one from scratch. So it took them years to build module by module by module up until they then got something that they are now rolling out. So that's kind of like a long way of doing things. But part of the thing as well is you have guys that will argue to say, is an EHR what we need when we don't have paracetamol or basic antibiotics or basic diagnostic services within our facilities. So there's that issue as well. And we also have to look at the state of infrastructure that many facilities don't have electricity, don't have power. But I think the best way to also answer those people to say, with the correct application of digital health or of ICT or technology, we can actually save some money that will allow us then to have a bit more to then divert towards where it should be going. There's quite a lot of money spent on fuel to ensure that a result is a lab result is put in a vehicle and driven over 100 km to get to the facility, when this could have been sent via email or via not even just a platform that people could easily access. So I think that mindset is going to change. And for Zimbabwe, what the ministry is doing, if they continue to do well and they succeed, this is an important foundational piece for digital health. So the future seems quite bright, and they've also outlined the framework for interoperability, which creates opportunity for entrepreneurs to then see how they can fit in their applications, whether it's if it's AI coming to then ride on top of the laboratory information system. There's quite some opportunity that they would have are going to create for entrepreneurs. So the future is bright. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chris, any parting shots you want to give us?
Sure. Yeah. Again, Marlon's saying a lot of things this evening that I agree with, and that really hits home when you say, we're spending money. Why talk about spending money on tech to try to save us when we can't even afford, or we don't even see paracetamol in hospitals? And I completely agree with that. I think we have so many systemic problems. I think looking to tech to try and solve them all is not the right way to do this. I think there's very high level policy that needs to change. And yeah, so while I'm definitely enthusiastic about the stuff that tech can do and the wins we can get from things like machine learning and AI, I do think that national health policy, global health policy, all of these things are really important. If more important than automatic diagnosis, let's say, for instance. So yeah, I just wanted to agree on that and we emphasize that. However, from our side, we shouldn't feel helpless either. I think today, one thing tech is giving us is we've never had so much opportunity to have access, let's say, to one another, to be able to be so interconnected. And I think there's a lot that we can achieve through this that we're only realizing now. And I think a really good example of this is the community that Sisonke Biotic, the one that I help run, forked off of. So they're called Mswaka. They, I think it was last year or the year before, again, just a loose collection of independent researchers and enthusiasts and people working in the African language space to do automatic translation. Completely part-time. They were able to win the Wikipedia Paper of the Year award, right? And since then they've had multiple publications. They have papers with something like 40 or 50 authors on them, and we're learning that we can, as individuals, affect change. We don't need to be part of some prestigious university. We don't need to have titles and anything like that. You just need to want to help, and then get involved in the communities and help in whichever way you can. So I mean, even now, I mean, Nyakabau is still pretty new. We've sort of proved this, like reaffirmed that this model works. We've got 2 papers that have been published in this way, just like through collaborative independent researchers working together. And I mean, that was a collaboration between like South Africa, Tunisia, Nigeria, like Pan-African, and like that to me, I find like really exciting. So I'm just going to put a link in the chat. If anyone wants to chat with me, drop into our community Discord. You're welcome to drop me a message anytime. And if you would like to collaborate on research, or if you'd like mentorship, we offer like peer-to-peer mentorship. It's a bit chaos, but that's fine. I think that's kind of like by design. You know, people, when we're doing this part-time, no single individual should be a bottleneck. So we have like different levels of engagement. And if you just want to hang around and like attend seminars, that's cool. If you want to get more involved and like try build software or try write papers, that's also cool. So we're trying to make a space for everyone, from both the medical side and the computer science side. So again, if you're a medical individual and you want to learn how to code, there are people in our community that would like to help you there. Yeah, anyway, come check us out. And also thanks for letting us talk this evening. This was fun. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks. Ify, I know you've got a lot to say. Parting shots from you, my friend.
No, I don't actually have that much to say. What I do want to say though is, I mean, I think it's very easy, where we live and, given what's happening in the world, to just focus on problems, and I think there'll always be problems in the region that we live. We're plagued by various different things, if it's not diseases, it's corruption, but us as entrepreneurs all sitting here, I mean, we got to look at these problems as like massive opportunities, right? And it's hard to solve. It is like in our region, it's tough. We don't have the same type of funding. We don't have similar type of opportunities, but you can create that. And as Chris was saying, these types of platforms, it brings people together, allows us to talk, it allows us to find what are the problems that each of us are having, what are the skills that each of us have. What opportunities can we open up for the other guys that can make it easier to actually implement and roll out your technology. And that's, yes, it's relevant in the health space. It's actually relevant across this tech ecosystem, and I think that's something that we should all be very, very positive about. If there's problems, that means there's something that needs to be fixed, and we are the ones that can go out there and fix it. I mean, we chose a problem. And we feel like we're going to make a real impact in the market and in people's lives, and we feel good about that. And it wasn't easy, but you get there. If you chip away, eventually, you find those opportunities. So while tech doesn't have all the answers, I think we do, right? And so every solution might not be a tech solution, but we can always find one. So I think that's very important. To stay positive there and innovate, keep doing it.
Okay, thanks for that. I think we're going to wrap up now. Just like to thank everyone who attended this talk, and especially to the panelists, Dr. Nyakabau, Chris, and Ify. Thank you so much, guys, for your insights. It seems from the chat that everyone learned quite a bit and they're inspired. And I hope that we can all share information, knowledge. Chris, please share your links on my email. And let's hope that we stop working in silos. South Africa is like literally our neighbor, so let's share ideas and yeah, let's all work together to bring up health tech within the SADC region. So thank you, everyone, and good night. Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye-bye.